a new grand compromise in content management. The session uh, is, I mean, the title is definitely quite inconspicuous. Preston, whenever you're ready, I, you know, if you can unmute yourself for a second, just to see if you're there.
Sure. Hi, I'm here.
All right. Thank you so much. So while I have a long, huge introduction for Preston on my end, I'd like to, the way I know him is that he speaks a lot of languages, and he's a great presenter. Whenever I've met him, he's been very, very nice, and he tries to speak in the language that we speak in. And I don't know why, but that stands out for me a lot in him. Otherwise, he is he's a product architect and strategist, and digital experience futurist, innovation lead, developer advocate, and he has spoken at SX South by Southwest several times, and he has authored Decoupled Drupal in practice. And yeah, there's a lot more that I'd like to read, but in the interest of time, I'd like to pass it on to Preston. And over to you, Preston. Thank you so much for doing this.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Parth. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. And we can go ahead and get started. And I'll also turn on my video. Okay. I can't do that, but let me start by sharing my screen here.
Let us allow you to do that. Hold on.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Let me just very quickly do that. Oh, okay. Looks like I'm still not able to do video, but that's okay. No problem. So let me just go ahead and start this presentation. Oops, that was the wrong button. There we go. Can you all see my screen? Okay, I'll take that as a yes. Thank you so much, Parth, for the amazing introduction, and I really appreciate that. I'll kind of start this off by saying that this presentation is going to be a little different from the others that you've seen today. It's a little bit less about Drupal and more about Drupal's place in the larger CMS market and kind of the general arena of content management that we find ourselves in. I have a very, very deep and huge place in my heart, by the way, for the entire Drupal community in India. And I wanted to, repeat something I say to everyone, which is that, my favorite DrupalCon by far was DrupalCon Mumbai back in, 2016 now. And I'm very excited once, obviously, the current circumstances are over to come back and see all of you and to hang out with all of you and share in some of our wonderful community. So this presentation is a new grand compromise in content management. I've given this presentation a couple of times before, but I've never given it to this large of an audience. So I'm very excited for the discussion that will come out of this. I won't repeat the introduction, suffice to say that if you would like to get a hold of me, you can get a hold of me either at preston.so@oracle.com, or you can also get a hold of me at preston.so, which is my website, /contact, and I'm also available on Twitter. By the way, in case you're looking for some reading while you're in quarantine or while you're at home, Decoupled Drupal in Practice is actually currently on sale for 20% off at springer.com until July 1st. And that's only until supplies last. So please feel free to use the code SODrupal to get that access code, that discount. Also, I run a conference in New York City called Decoupled Days. We're in our 4th year. We're going virtual this year. We'd love to see all of you there as well. We've decided to reduce our ticket prices down to $10, which is the lowest that we've ever had our ticket prices. We've got 30 amazing talks on a variety of different topics related to Decoupled Drupal, as well as headless and decoupled CMS at large. So I wanted to cover a couple of different things today, and once again, this is going to be very different from the presentations that you're seeing today in that I definitely want to focus on Drupal, but I want to zoom all the way out to the bigger picture, not just what's happening in the Drupal community, not just what's happening in the Drupal ecosystem, but what's happening in terms of the larger market and the larger open source ecosystem that we find ourselves in. One of the things that is really interesting about current circumstances is that we're really entering into what I would call a second CMS war, or a second war between content management systems. And one of the things that happened over the course of the last several decades is that we've gone through a period of several what we call browser wars, which were very similar to the ways in which the CMS war, the first CMS war, has actually transpired. And I'll share a little bit about this progression here right now. One of the things that we notice about this current state of the market is that as of the last 3 to 4 years, we've been seeing an explosion in competitors in the CMS market space, competitors not only of Drupal, but also my employer, Oracle. And one of the things that we're finding is that back in the day, a lot of these CMSs were things that we generally knew very well. They were known quantities. Episerver, Adobe Experience Manager, in the enterprise kind of segment, Sitecore as well. Now, of course, we have players like Drupal and WordPress that are in the open source market. And of course, my own CMS that I represent, Oracle Content and Experience. But there's also newer CMSs that are now entering the market that have really come about, that have started to challenge our pre-existing notions and our foregoing presuppositions about exactly how the CMS should work and exactly how the CMS should look and exactly how the CMS should behave. And some examples of this are obviously some of the really well-known headless CMSs like Contentful and Datto CMS and Sanity, but also some of the newer upstarts. Prismic, for example, that relies on an SDK-based strategy rather than an API-based strategy, or Forestry, which is a Git-based CMS. The CMS market is changing very rapidly because we're seeing a very, very important shift towards new models and new approaches to performing content management from the variety of all the personas that we have to work with. Contentful, for example, one of the really nice things about Contentful is that it provides this very, very nice custom content modeling experience that is also very, very favorable for the developer. As you can see here in the screen, you've got a second tab here that says JSON Preview, kind of similar to the local actions bar that we have in Drupal. And one of the things that you can very easily do with all of these content types is to consume them through your decoupled consumers or your headless CMS consumers. Prismic takes a bit of a different tack where they focus on enabling developers with developer tools, but they don't actually expose some of the underlying data service pieces that would make this a very, very compelling option for headless CMS or decoupled CMS users. But one of the things that I find very interesting about Prismic is the fact that just like Contentful, they have really focused on this developer audience. Who is it that is doing the building? Who is it that is doing the implementation? Who is it that is writing custom code that's going to rely on this foundation? It's generally speaking going to be the developer. And there's also a very recent new CMS that has really kind of emerged onto the market named Sanity, and I'm sure many of you have probably looked at Sanity and experimented with it. One of the things that Sanity really, really does well is the fact that it's incredibly useful for developers who need to be able to interact with their data in a variety of different ways. But one of the things that you might have noticed from those three CMSs that I just featured in this headless CMS market is that, well, all three of them are really good for developers. But the question that I want to ask today, and the question I want to pose to you all today, especially in the context of how Drupal will respond to some of these new market trends, is how effective are these CMSs, not just for the developer, but also for all of the other users that we have to deal with. Whether you're located in Mumbai or in Chennai or in Pune or in Kolkata, you know that there are clients and there are customers all over India, all over the world, all over Europe, all over Latin America that need to be able to interact with their content management system in a way that goes well beyond code. And we know this from our experiences working with customers. We know this from our experiences working with our very own clients. And this is, of course, borne out by a lot of the projects that we've seen emerge in the Drupal world. There's one very important lagging indicator that is a very important kind of trendsetter for us to really scrutinize. And this is the very first time where I would say that we've finally gotten to a place in our timeline where the headless or decoupled CMS has become a formidable player, not only in terms of the innovative developer experiences and the innovative user experiences that we want to build, but also from the standpoint of the market analysts and the enterprise segment and those who are watching with the really big checkbooks who are going to be able to write those checks that will actually determine the future of their own platforms for years to come. One of the things that happened earlier this year that you might have noticed is CMS War reported this, and Gartner, which is a very important market analyst that looks at different markets and looks at different sectors of markets to understand exactly how the industry is doing, they recently decided to retire one of the most important reports they publish every year, which is the Gartner Magic Quadrant for Web Content Management. Their argument, of course, is that there's really no such thing as web content management anymore in terms of a unique differentiator across the market, because these headless CMSs have emerged, but also there's been what Gartner calls a commoditization of a lot of these CMS features. Whereas about 20 years ago, custom content modeling or things like in-place editing or things like rich text formatting were very much differentiators in the CMS market. Today, they're considered table stakes. Today, they're considered base level requirements that every single CMS should have out of the box. And this is a reimagining of the goalposts, a moving of the goalposts in order to accommodate the new market that we see ourselves in. And Forrester, which is another important market analyst that a lot of our customers and a lot of organizations around the world are following, they've also said that what they call the classic era of web content management is now at an end. And there's now this thing called the Agile CMS, which is now not only representative of the websites that we're building, but also the other experiences that we have to contend with, as well as the other people and other departments that we have to enable collaboration with. So Gartner has chosen this new phrase, digital experience platform, and already we have seen a lot of folks in the Drupal ecosystem begin to adopt this terminology. Acquia, for example, has very much taken on the moniker of an open digital experience platform. But what exactly does this DXP or digital experience platform really mean? Well, for that, we have to turn to some of the kinds of analyses and assessments of this new trend that are happening in the market. My friend Deane Barker over at Episerver says this. So there will be two sides, content management and experience management. Many of these systems, like Episerver or like Drupal, for example, will cover both. Other systems, like headless vendors, will only be on the content side. And this really spotlights one of the biggest problems that these headless or decoupled CMS vendors have. The notion that Contentful or Sanity or Prismic can provide the rich and interactive and in context and really fully efficient experience that Drupal provides for marketing teams and for teams that are not developers and are not working with code editors is something that is pretty laughable. You really can't say that Contentful provides the same kind of rich experience that Drupal does out of the box for editors. But there's a reason why it's become very popular. And for that, we have to turn a little bit to our history. The CMS wars really reflect the browser wars back in the day. And the browser wars, if you look at very, very early days of the World Wide Web, where Mosaic 1.0 was first released, for example, one of the things you notice is that the first browser war, which Wikipedia says lasted from roughly 1995 to 2002, were focused on two different aspects of their implementation. The first was around product packaging, and Microsoft was really successful in winning this battle by ensuring, just like America Online did earlier, by ensuring that every single installation of Microsoft Windows operating system would come with a copy of Internet Explorer already configured as the default browser. But that aside, the more interesting thing that I find about the first browser war is that there was a really big fight and a lot of combat around the feature completeness that these browsers were able to provide. And one of the things that you find with the first browser war is that there's a lot of cases where there are these certain tags or certain elements or certain features that we have in browsers today which weren't there before and reflected this kind of motion towards feature completeness that the first browser war represented. If you consider things like Netscape Navigator 2, for example, which was, Netscape was the first to introduce some of these tags, Blink and Marquee, that obviously are not part of the standard, what we consider milieu of HTML today, but are still very much part of that initial motion towards greater feature completeness. And I want to focus on that notion of feature completeness here. Of course, Internet Explorer 4 was able to take advantage of this kind of packaging with Microsoft Windows to introduce their own ideas about how the web should work and how web standards should actually evolve. The second browser war, however, which lasted from roughly 2004 to 2017, was very different. Obviously, you had much more competition coming from players like Google Chrome or Mozilla Firefox. And one of the things that was really important about this era is that it wasn't so much about the feature completeness. It was rather about things like whether or not you want it to be open source or closed source. One thing that you might not know about the history of web browsers is that Netscape Navigator, when it was defeated by Internet Explorer during the first browser war, very soon after that, Netscape was actually open sourced and became the kind of, from its ashes, became reborn as Firefox. But of course, we know that there are still proprietary browsers out there like Internet Explorer that are not able to kind of leverage the open source ecosystems that are available. So that's one very interesting dimension of the second browser war, but I also find very interesting the notion of user experience improvements during the second browser war. The fact that Google Chrome and Mozilla Firefox were really about not only the ability for developers to build interactive user experiences with DHTML, dynamic HTML, and JavaScript and jQuery on the front end, but also the fact that with debugging tools like Firebug and some of these emerging developer debugging tools like Chrome DevTools, now you're seeing this changing notion of what a user experience for the browser actually means. So the CMS and browser wars are very similar. And if we look at the first and second browser wars, the first browser war was really about feature completeness. It was about the race to build new features that are essentially going to differentiate yourselves in the market. Then you've got user experience, the notion that you need to serve better these better experiences on the devices that users are working with, and to serve more interactive, more rich, more kind of pleasant experiences that really reflect the expectations of users today. So if we compare the first browser war and the first CMS war, and I'll share the first CMS war very shortly here, one of the things that we notice is that just as this feature completeness was a very important optimal goal for browsers, it was also an important goal for CMSs. If you think about the fact that initially CMSs were these static site builders or very simplistic blogging or publishing tools, or really kind of very rudimentary message board tools like PHPBB or some of these older kind of bulletin board tools. These kind of tools had very limited functionality and flexibility, but the CMS really exploded for the first time because of this notion of server-side dynamism, this notion that, yes, you should be able to set certain things and you should be able to have a fully rendered, fully realized web page be generated by a CMS on the back end rather than having some kind of a static generator or some kind of a static approach. And this was very important because this heralded this new era of CMS evolution, where now you're seeing not only some of the most important features of the CMS market emerge in this period, such as custom content modeling or query building, as you see in Views, but also things that are a little bit more antiquated or considered more anachronistic today. Things like the color picker, or things that allow you to configure different visual elements of your website. So the first CMS war really gave way away from these static site CMSs over to the CMSs that would exhibit this rich server-side dynamism like Drupal. And it exactly reflected this feature completeness battle that occurred in the first browser war as well. There was this race to implement unique features like content modeling, the custom CCK content modeling that we now have in Drupal, or the custom query building that we now have thanks to Views. And of course, we had some things that, just like the blank and marquee tags, are relatively in disuse today. They're not really used by a whole lot of folks. Of course, there are still Drupal users out there and Drupal site owners out there who still use these features, but they're certainly not something that is in common installation across all of our Drupal implementations. And for the very prime example of this, of course, is the color module. And some of Drupal's most widely used features emerged during this time. And it wasn't just the fact that we introduced things like the color module to Drupal core. It was also things like introducing custom content modeling, custom query builders. And this is really what transitioned the CMS away from being a more simplistic blogging tool or a more simplistic message board or discussion tool into a very rich content management system that was really reflective of the kinds of customization and the kinds of flexibility that editors and marketing organizations really need. But as you see, just like Blink and Marquee, Drupal's color module is kind of in disuse, and we're seeing now this second CMS war beginning to emerge that is actually, in my opinion, very much following the same progression and the same kinds of battlefield areas that first CMS war and the first browser war, or sorry, the second browser war undertook. And that was, of course, the fact that now in the second CMS war, we see these headless CMSs entering the market and new CMS architectures emerging. India, for example, is one of the primary nexuses of innovation in decoupled Drupal. But of course, one of the problems that is still one of the big things that we have to solve for with regards to our customers, with regards to our users, is the ability for us to serve an exceptionally ideal user experience. But one of the things that I wanted to note here is that the CMS doesn't necessarily have to just deal with the end user like the browser does. It also has to deal with a variety of different other CMS users that are fully immersed in this collaborative experience, in this collaborative conduit of productivity. And this user experience is, of course, important still in this notion of perceived and performance, perceived interactivity, just like the browsers, but it's a little bit different. And I want to really call out this key distinction between the second browser war and the second CMS war. One of the things that we know about the second browser war is that there was this emergence of client-side dynamism, this idea that JavaScript is now the primary way that you should interact with different front-end tools and different front-end mechanisms to build these more rich interfaces. And in the initial stages of the second CMS war, you began to see this kind of adoption of these innovative JavaScript techniques really, really begin to take over kind of the CMS world as well. This gave way, of course, to headless CMSs and also decoupled Drupal, headless WordPress, a lot of the new kinds of API-driven or API-based or API-only approaches that we see today. But one of the things that is really interesting about the browser war and the CMS war of the last decade, of the last several decades, of course, not the first one, is the fact that the end user experience is a very interesting, multifaceted kind of a problem in the CMS world in a way that it really wasn't in the browser war. The browser only has to deal with one single user, and that is the end user. Fundamentally, right? All of these different tools that we use point towards improving the experience of that end user who is looking at their screen, seeing their browser, and staring at whatever content is on the page. But the CMS is very different. The CMS is not a one persona product. And this is really one of the things that makes the CMS unique among different software projects and different software products in the world, is that CMSs have to grapple with many different personas. They have to consider many different priorities and many different kinds of notions of what the CMS is meant to be. Obviously, what an editor decides what a CMS is very different from what a marketing professional will decide what a CMS is. And that is also very different today from how a developer will describe a CMS. There's a point in the fossil record where there was a massive explosion in life forms. And the notion of an explosion in the biological history of the web is very interesting because of the fact that it denotes this point in time where there was an inflection. And there was a point at which the massive diversification that led to the life forms that we have today now is part of our conception of how we think of nature. And this Cambrian explosion, this kind of proliferation of new life forms, this dissemination of new clades in the biological tree is exactly what's happening right now in our world of marketing. We now are experiencing a Cambrian explosion in the kinds of content delivery channels and the destinations where our content needs to go. We're facing problems of mobile applications having to ingest content. And we're also facing the problem of having smart TVs and set-top boxes like Roku that have to be able to ingest content from a single CMS. We also have wearable technologies now, which are forcing us to rethink the ways in which we think about content and recast how exactly we're delivering content in a way that will make sense to a user of an Apple Watch or a user of a Fitbit or a user of a Garmin watch. We're also contending, of course, with digital signage and the fact that oftentimes content needs to be blown up and shortened to its very, very essence and not really extended any further. And how does digital signage change the way that our CMSs work today? And finally, of course, augmented reality, or some of the novel interfaces that we see emerging today, like conversational interfaces, especially in voice. And I know that voice is a very, very important part of exactly how we're dealing with the currently ongoing pandemic in ways that allow us to contend with some of the loneliness or social isolation we feel. As a matter of fact, earlier this week, the New York Times had a report about how chatbots that are able to interact with users in a very rich and personified way are also able to help them deal with, especially help people who are struggling with loneliness and social isolation during this pandemic that's currently afflicting the entire world. But here's the problem, and this is the issue that we have today, is that because of the fact that the CMS is dealing with not just a single user base, but also developers and marketers and editors and project managers and product managers and compliance officers and other folks who need to be involved in this collaborative center that represents the CMS, is the fact that every single one of these personas has a completely different impression of what the CMS should be and what their optimal workflow and what their ideal utopian CMS looks like. And this is borne out by one of the key distinctions between the requirements that marketers and content editors tend to have for their CMSs versus the kinds of requirements and kinds of demands that developers have for those same CMSs. And there is one fundamental truth that we see emerging from this channel explosion, this Cambrian explosion, not of life forms, but of form factors. And that is that marketers and editors and these folks who are working in the confines and in the purview and have as their remit the ability to collaborate on content and to create and strategize on content that is really oriented towards the needs of the user rather than the developer experience for developer needs, is that they need that control over non-web experiences. They need that same kind of marketing level control that they had today, and they need that on those other experiences too. So one of the things that I wanted to note here also is the fact that there's a very, very strong incongruity. And for those of you who have seen some of my previous talks on this subject, I've delved into this topic before, where one of the biggest issues that we have today with our new kind of multi-channel, omni-channel world is the fact that fundamentally there's only two of these channels that you see on the screen being available for marketers and content editors to manipulate and manage and edit and evolve and innovate on in a rich way. When it comes to all of these other channels that are out there, there's still the purview and the jurisdiction of developers that are able to write custom code and write and consume APIs and work with data. But the thing that a lot of these headless CMS vendors and a lot of these decoupled CMS proponents don't realize is the fact that when you introduce this incongruity as a baseline foundation for how users are encompassing and envisaging the CMS, what you're actually doing is you're putting them on an uneven playing field. Developers are able to build any one of these experiences, which means that they have all the power. But when it comes to marketers and content editors and project managers and product managers and compliance reviewers, the fact that they only have access to manipulating and enriching and directly customizing and working with and extending websites and responsive design, and maybe in some cases like Oracle's CMS, mobile apps, is something that is deeply, deeply worrying about the state of the content management system and how exactly it will look in the future. The CMS has always been built on an uneasy balance, this kind of uneasy, slightly tense equilibrium, this alliance between different personas that was forced during the very early days of the CMS's first emergence. And the problem that we see today is, in some ways, very much reflective of the world that we live in today in terms of the economic inequality and, of course, some of the issues that we face in our society, is that not all of these CMS personas are treated equal anymore. And they're not equal in the eyes of CMS law. They're not equal in the eyes of CMS rights and in the eyes of the fact that the CMS needs to be able to serve all of these different personas and all of these different populations in the exact same way as they have been able to before. And this is the fundamental issue that faces content management today. This is the fundamental problem that we have to figure out as a market, that we have to figure out as a software community and as a software ecosystem. Otherwise, there could be some really big problems down the road. And this is, in my view, the key core fundamental issue and fundamental question that we have to resolve in order for the CMS to survive as it is today. Back in 2017 at DrupalCon Vienna, I presented a session that was called Decoupled Site Building. And it was about this ostensible notion, the kind of putative idea that you can have a CMS that is not only omni-channel and not only decoupled, not only enabled for all of the different user experiences that you have to serve and build for, but that also is a great experience for the editors and marketers who up until now have been able to edit and administer and manipulate their websites in a very rich way. And I presented this diagram here, this graph, which shows what I see as being one of the fundamental issues that faces not only Drupal, but also WordPress and all of these other legacy or traditional CMSs that we see in the market today. And that is that up until about 2014, 2015, one of the really nice things about Drupal and the nice things about CMSs was that, what was generally better for developers, what was generally better for marketers, was going to lead to a better outcome for every single end user who was going to work with these experiences that we're building for our customers. But of course, with the evolution of headless CMSs, we've seen that this actually isn't the case. What's better for developers is not necessarily better for all users, because if we think about users as not just the end users of our CMS, namely the customers that we're serving, but we also think about the users that are internal to organizations, like developers and marketers and editors and compliance teams, that actually this kind of decoupling, this headless architecture is not something that makes the CMS a better experience for everyone across the board. And recently I extended this in a series of thoughts that I shared on my blog about the fact that one of the problems that we're seeing is this dichotomy, this schism, this bifurcation in the CMS market, where you're seeing growth in the number of channels causing the adoption of headless CMSs and causing people to go more towards that ideal developer experience. But then you're getting this backlash. You're getting this buyer's remorse from marketers and editors who are saying, I need to still have the ability to do layout management. I still need to have the ability to do things like in-place editing, and I need to be able to do things like preview and workflow management across all of my editorial pipelines that I have. And so what you're seeing now is this counter-reaction, this countervailing force that is saying that this pressure from editorial needs, this pressure from the fact that our editors and marketers still need to have this rich access to all these features is an important opposite force that is fighting back against kind of the notion that the headless CMS is the end-all be-all solution. So, of course, the problem with the DXP, as Gartner has started to frame it, is that it's about multiple digital experiences. Web content management was primarily about a single website or a few websites, but not about this notion that you need to serve AR, VR experiences or digital signage or information kiosks or conversational interfaces or chatbots or other devices that we might not have even heard of. But the problem is that today, one of the things we're facing, and I see this all throughout every single conversation I have with marketing teams that have adopted but now regret a headless CMS purchase, and that is that it leads to happy developers but unhappy marketers. The problem that we face today is that content necessarily has to look different on every channel, and developers know this, and developers acknowledge this, and developers will build for this. But this leaves marketers in the dust. This leaves marketers behind, and it puts marketers in a very, very deeply underprivileged position. So the question that I wanted to ask, and the question that I've been asking over the past 4 years is site building dead? Is this notion of creating a page or a display or a templated, laid out, dragged and dropped, laid out page, is that something that is no longer possible? Is that something that we have to go ahead and leave aside because of the fact that it's not something that's very easy to build for when it comes to voice or some of these other interfaces that we want to build for? And so this brings me to my kind of key point, and this is where I really want to stress my view on the matter, which is that the holy grail of DXP, or the holy grail of this kind of experience management, or this kind of multi-channel experience management, is presentation management. It's not just content management, it's about presentation management. It's not just about the ability to manage how content is displayed in terms of the sequencing or the ordering or how you split up a template into cards on a smartphone. As a matter of fact, it's really about this unique middle point, this meeting ground between the developer experience and the market experience that allows for the developer to retain the really nice things that we know they went over to the headless CMS landscape for. Because we know that developers today, especially in the JavaScript world, don't like to use Twig. They don't like to use PHP template. They don't like to use these foregoing old, what they see as anachronistic or antiquated templating tools. They want to use JSX. They want to use MDX. They want to use React. They want to use Vue.js. They want to use Svelte. So it's not just about how we allow for the editorial experience and the marketing experience to be restored, but it's also about how do we meet the developers somewhat where they are today, because we know that there's been a big reason why they've gone into this direction. So it's about how do we find that new balance, that new compromise between developers and marketers that will allow for developers to keep their optimal developer experience that they now have, but also restores some of that important functionality that editors and marketers had before. So as I mentioned, digital experience management, or this idea of DXP, yes, it's about all of the other things that Gartner talks about, things like digital asset management and SEO and all of these things that are so important, personalization, for example, machine learning and kind of personalized recommendations, the next best experience. Those are all important things. But to me, I'm much more interested in how digital experience management redemocratizes and restores the balance that we had before in the CMS world. That was a very unique thing that we had that many other software ecosystems and software verticals simply don't have. The vast majority of software ecosystems today, if you think about different sectors like human capital management or things that are like enterprise record management, or some of the things that are involved in CRM tools or sales tools, those are all fundamentally focused on a very concrete, very focused audience. But the DXP, the CMS, has never had that luxury. We've always had to deal with many different kinds of users who have very different backgrounds, very different lived experiences, who now have to collaborate on this single unified tool. So the challenge is exactly how do we make sure that both developer teams and marketer teams are satisfied? Well, one thing that we can know is that the separation of concerns in CMSs is shifting quite rapidly. And this is something that I wanted to share just to indicate how exactly our developers are now moving in this direction. Now we're seeing this trend towards what is called proudly rendered elsewhere. We know about the general adage in the Drupal community about proudly found elsewhere. But now we're seeing that rendering is no longer taking place in the CMS. And we're seeing, for example, CMSs either go in the direction of where they're rendering out just small HTML snippets instead and serving those out. Or they're just using an API to serve this data out. And the rendering happens fundamentally and as a rule on each of these other channels that the CMS has to serve. There's also a problem that's emerging where we now have the problem of one-to-one to one-to-many. And one of the things that I've found is that it's not just one single front end that we're dealing with anymore in terms of JavaScript or mobile or AR/VR. There's a variety of different front ends that we now have to contend with. And I will think of, for example, one case study of a customer that I spoke with last year, or of an enterprise Drupal user I spoke with last year, that has a very unique architecture because of certain requirements and certain needs that they had. What they did is they have their existing Drupal front end, but they're also using React, Angular, and Ember front ends simultaneously at the same time as they're using these other front ends that they have. This is a very, very interesting kind of trend that's happening. And of course, one of the things we're seeing as well is that JavaScript-driven rendering is now encroaching on some of the old confines and some of the old purview of CMS server-side rendering. We're now seeing, for example, the fact that the API is now the CMS front end, or what we consider to be something that is where this data is being served to. And now we're moving down stack. We're moving further and further back in the architectural stack to be able to do richer rendering and allow for more interactive experiences that really work for those users. And so now what we're seeing is this very interesting and very compelling separation of concerns that's not happening inside the CMS as we saw before, but is now happening outside the CMS. And it's now challenging the very notion of what the CMS means from the standpoint of how it should operate as software. So one thing I wanted to do here is to spend the rest of the day today, my time with you all today, to dive into some of the things that we need to do to think about how this will work in Drupal. And one of the questions that I often receive about the ideas that I share in this presentation is the fact that, well, okay, great, like, this is very clear, we need to do this work, but how do we actually do it? What is the kind of thinking and the strategizing that we need to do to be able to really hone in on all of the different use cases that we know are going to be important for the future of the CMS user base? So how do we help in these situations where marketers feel left behind? And if you go and take a survey of any of the marketing teams that have bought headless CMSs recently, you feel that buyer's remorse, very, very much so, in terms of this notion of, we bought this CMS thinking that it was going to help us innovate, help us really move forward with these highly performant, highly secure, highly interactive presentation layers and these highly interactive user experiences, but fundamentally we feel left behind because we've lost a lot of the functionality that we had before. Our hands are now tied in ways that we never had to deal with before. So, but by the same token, we also have to help developers out too, because developers have protested for several years against things like Twig or things like Drupal's Ajax framework or things like the way in which we do PHP template. And this is not, by the way, the fault of any of the amazing contributors and the amazing folks who have built Twig and built PHP template and built these amazing projects. It's more a factor of the fact that developers have emerged and grown up in newer environments and have different lived experiences that privilege in their mind or prestige in their mind using JavaScript or using technologies that they prefer. So we have to help them too somehow. And what we're seeing, of course, is this bifurcation. And this is another kind of illustration of that graph I shared earlier, where you're seeing that originally our old CMS, the original WCM, Web Content Management System, was originally in this very nice nexus where you had both developer manipulability and marketer manipulability in a way that enriched both of their experiences. But today what you're seeing, of course, is that for headless CMSs are much more usable by developers and not by marketers. And vice versa, of course, monolithic CMSs are usable by marketers, not so much by developers. But the problem that we see and the problem that we know is that a lot of marketing teams still control the checkbook when it comes to purchasing a CMS product or deciding to re-platform or undertake a transition like this. And one of the things we also know is that WYSIWYG was really great for web design, but as soon as these new interactive, new kinds of enriching experiences came into play around things like jQuery and things like JavaScript and DHTML, WYSIWYG is not something that's so great for web programming. And in the sense, we've left behind a lot of these editors and marketers that were able to grow up in this era when they were able to change the rich text and change the layout of a page, but now they can't do it because we've introduced JavaScript into the mix. So these marketers' dreams have never ended. Marketers who used to use FrontPage, used to use Dreamweaver, used to use Adobe XD, used to use some of these really amazing design tools that also yielded websites. Those dreams have never really ended. And we have to think about the fact that there's a new kind of categorization of CMSs where we're increasingly seeing this schism, where now monolithic CMSs like Drupal and WordPress are for marketers and for editors and for these non-developer user segments, whereas headless CMSs are for developers. And this is a very dangerous situation that we find ourselves in, because the more we go into this direction where these two sides are not talking to one another and don't see eye to eye, the more likely it is that we'll see a permanent split in the CMS market. Developer CMSs and marketing CMSs, which is a future I don't think that any of us wants. So tight coupling is no longer the answer for these kinds of architectures, but what exactly is the answer? Should it remain this kind of fully encompassed WCM style editorial experience, or should it become a content repository, a mere series of APIs, a mere store for your content? Or is it really a conjunct of collaborative workflows for both editors and developers that allow you to gravitate around this happy medium, this uneasy compromise that we used to have before? We know that marketers are fickle, and we know that marketer requirements run along a spectrum. One of the things that I do know about marketing teams is that there is a certain amount of prioritization they do with regards to what features they absolutely need and what features they might be able to do without and consider luxuries. For example, I would say that it's pretty much a very, very clear thing that every single marketing team and every single editorial team needs to have some kind of a preview before content goes live. But does that mean that they need to have drag and drop layout building? Does that mean that they have to have in place rich text editing? I don't know if that's necessarily true. And that's where we have to focus our attention, is that there are certain areas where drag and drop layout building, in place editing makes absolutely no sense. Like, you can't do it on a smartwatch, and I don't know why you would want to do in place editing on an information kiosk unless you're building a very rich and interesting application for your users. There was a sociologist and philosopher named Abraham Maslow who came up with an idea called the hierarchy of needs. And I want to delve into this idea as a framework for how we can think about how Drupal needs to evolve to really capture this ideal and really auspicious moment in history for us to grab both horns and say that we are very firmly in both segments of the market. But before I continue, I do need to note that Abraham Maslow, despite his Jewish heritage, was a very, very problematic figure in terms of his views. And a lot of his historical, antiquated views are things that would be considered very, very much exclusionary today. And so it's important to mention that as you go out and you know, if you want to read about Maslow's writings, if you want to read Maslow directly, it's important, of course, keep it in the historical context in which he lived. The hierarchy of needs is basically a framework that Maslow contended was this ability for us to say that there are certain prioritized needs that every single human being has. On the very bottom, you have physiological needs, and these are the very, very core needs that humans have to survive, namely food and water. But as you go up the pyramid, one of the things you notice is that there are other things that people need that once they've had their needs for food or shelter or water met, you can keep on going up in this chain to the point where once all of your worldly needs are met, you can finally self-actualize or begin to realize your true self and your true ability to be who you are and your true identity. We can expand this hierarchy of needs, of course, to the ways in which marketers and developers think about the ways in which they need their CMSs to work and the ways in which they want their CMS to operate. A developer hierarchy of needs, for example, for a headless Drupal CMS might be to have API availability. But just as I mentioned before, does that API availability necessarily mean that every single possible task or action in the CMS is also exposed to that API? I'm not so sure about that. And this is the kind of framework that will help us understand where does that kind of threshold lie? At what point do we know that humans can operate and survive, can users operate and survive without feeling like they're losing functionality? Before the headless CMS emerged, one of the things that we know is that marketers had a very rigid and a very clear hierarchy of needs, starting, of course, at the very bottom with preview, but going up until this kind of ideal state, this optimal dream world of having true WYSIWYG, where they could manipulate every single aspect of every single experience on the page. So one of the things that we know, however, is that now that we have these new channels and now that we have these new content delivery destinations, we know that marketers are necessarily going to have different hierarchies of needs and different prioritizations of these needs based on what channel we're talking about. A web experience, like a JavaScript-driven experience, is going to have obviously higher expectations of content templating, layout management, and some of these things that we know that that marketers and editors need to be able to use in the context of the CMS. But is that so true for digital signage? Is that so true for voice? Is that so true for some of the things that we know are things that don't really apply to these higher level of these pyramids? How do you do layout management or content templating for a voice interface in a CMS? So there are certain thresholds and certain things that we know that because these are still early days and because there isn't a very codified or very clear best practice for content management of voice, there's going to be a threshold at which we'll have to say, that's enough, that's okay, we'll figure out the rest of the problems later. There's also a branch of geology called stratigraphy. And I wanted to mention this here because one of the things that you might not know about me is that as a kid, I wanted to become a geologist. I wanted to become a field geologist. I wanted to put on a backpack, put on a hard hat, and go and pick at some rocks and go and look at all of these really cool land formations that are out there. And I love this idea of this job because you can go and travel around, go hiking, go backpacking, and find some really amazing fossils or some really amazing evidence of how the world looked thousands and millions of years ago. But of course, then I ran into the fact that I'm a horrible, horrible student of physics. I'm really bad at physics, I'm really bad at chemistry, and that's where my dreams die. But that doesn't mean that geology isn't still a big part of my life and I still don't have an interest in geological concepts. And stratigraphy is a very, very important concept in geology. It's fundamentally, at its core, the notion that you can determine relationships in time and different ways in which these kinds of layers formed based on how the layers stack on top of each other. And if we think about stratigraphy in the context of hierarchies of needs, we know that these strata or these layers or this stratification that is displayed by the hierarchies of needs is something that also undergoes deformation and also undergoes different fluxes. One of the things that people say about the hierarchy of needs under Maslow's conception of it is that oftentimes the hierarchy of needs can flip over. It can change. Some of the layers can reorder. Some of the priorities can get scrambled. And maybe some of them are actually parallel and part of the same layer, part of the same stratum. Stratigraphy is also about how deformations flip over rock layers or re-angle rock layers or completely churn out these different rock formations that are not representative or not reflective of their previous renditions. And in that same way, one of the things that a lot of geologists will do is they'll look for that kind of strata that is able to be shared across multiple different areas of rock or certain geological areas, because they can understand that this shared stratum represented a point that is shared by both of these different rock formations, despite the fact that they might look very different in their stratigraphy. By the same token, we can find a strata of compromise that runs across all of the different channels that we have to deal with and all of the different personas that we contend with as well to find that minimum viability threshold across all of these experiences in a way that makes every single persona happy. Of course, the problem is that before this, back in the day with the first CMS, we had to do this with personas, but not with channels. And today we have to do it with both. And that's where, of course, a lot of our problems lie today. There's also a lot of people who are working to scale the marketer's hierarchy of needs, which is to say that a lot of these headless CMS vendors and a lot of these new frameworks that are emerging are trying to resolve this problem for a lot of these users that need to be able to do this kind of functionality. If you're interested in more about this kind of scaling of the hierarchy of needs, please head to my blog where you can find a lot more information about this. To finish off here, I want to share some final thoughts before I turn to questions. Obviously, one of the things that is important to any kind of world building or any kind of actual state management in the context of how we're actually building societies that are equal, how we're actually building social and civil rights and social justice that actually makes sense, is the idea of compromise. And one of the most important compromises in American history happened thanks to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where it was determined that, okay, states that have very large populations will not have more representation in the Senate than states that have small populations. And by the same token, states that are very, very large in population will have more representation in the House of Representatives than states that have low populations too. But no state will have more power than another in the Senate. If you know a little bit about the U.S. kind of political history and the ways in which the U.S. legislature has formed, you know that this compromise has been very, very critical to how the U.S. has grown over the course of time. And we need this kind of great compromise within the CMS world. There is historical precedent to this kind of idea. And we need to make sure to enable these non-negotiable must-have features that marketers have. We're not in a post-content era. We're not in a post-visual era, much as these headless CMSs want to say. We're definitely not in that content is only data world. In the traditional CMS, content was necessarily presented. Content was something that was part and parcel and inextricable from the way that it was visually represented. And marketers do not want to give up some of these key features, as we know very well. And we know that neither of the kinds of CMSs we see in the market is a silver bullet right now. So we need something different. We need a new grand compromise. We need to have a new balance between the CMSs that really characterized the CMS in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Because we know that our personas, our marketers and developers, never, ever work in isolation. Real content collaboration requires the unification and the intersection of a variety of different personas. So our new grand compromise is necessarily going to have to involve new workflows, new approaches, new architectures, new stacks, new frameworks, new processes. But if we think about Drupal, this is the way that Drupal emerged and how it's become so successful, is that developers and marketers came together to find that common ground, that middle ground, and we can repair the schism by enabling both. So our next challenge as the CMS market, our next challenge as the Drupal ecosystem, is to restore that equilibrium that first drove us to the success, that first drove us to the amazing result that we have today, which is, of course, to power 2% of the web. Let's power more than just 2% of the web. Let's power more than 2% of everything beyond the web. And how we do that is up to us. Thank you very much. Here are some resources. I will send these slides out, of course, as well. Please feel free to check out my blog, preston.so/writing, if you want to see more information about any of the stuff I covered today. Thank you very much. As I mentioned earlier, please come to the Decoupled Days. Tickets are only $10. And please feel free to purchase my book, 20% off with the code SODrupal at springer.com until July 1st. Thank you, and I'll take questions.
Thank you so much, Preston. So we already have one question from Deane in the chats. I'll very quickly take that. He says that gaming has surpassed the movies and entertainment industry. Beyond browser and smartphone, what personal device or experience do you think can garner similar interests and volume?
That's a great question. Well, I can think of one example already, and I don't know if my dear friend from Srijan Gaurav Mishra is on the call, but I know that Gaurav, for example, and Srijan are very, very invested in voice. I believe that voice is going to be one of those kind of experiences that's going to become extremely important to how the future of content will work. One of the things you're already seeing, of course, is that the pandemic is accelerating adoption of voice interfaces. You're seeing more voice-operated doors, more voice-operated kinds of things that are happening in the world. And so my contention is that we're going to see a lot of voice interfaces emerge, a lot of focus on voice and conversational tools, because people like to have these kinds of experiences that are more human. That being said, however, I think the other place where we're going to start to see a lot of different kinds of personal devices and experiences start to emerge is in the world of what I would call spatial content. And it's, this idea, of course, of extended reality, augmented and virtual reality, but also things like beacon technology or things like remote sensing that allow for basically the, connection of spatial and physical worlds to the content itself. And so I think those two areas, voice and spatial content, are going to become extremely crucial to experiences over the next few years.
Thank you so much. Oh, yeah, there you are. Thank you so much for responding to that message very quickly. So right now we don't have any more questions. Oh, okay. Abhay seems to have raised their hand. Abhay, if you have any questions, can you please pour them into the Q&A section so that we can see them as questions? We're still waiting. I think your talk was so good that people got everything and they don't have any questions. And this is a very typical response that a lot of hosts have when we don't get any questions. Okay. It seems that people don't have any questions, genuinely.
Sure. Well, please feel free to reach out to me at preston.so@oracle.com. I'm also on Twitter. Or you can also contact me on my website. Very happy to talk more about this and learn more about how all of you are thinking about this and some great ideas that you might have. So thank you so much to the entire Drupal India Association for the invitation. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your conclave. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Preston. Hope you have a nice day.